Welcome to Silvicast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we're both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your host for today's show. Well, Brad, congratulations. We officially wrapped up our first season of fantasy football.
You know, Greg, I'm not really sure what it says about us that it took us this long to actually discover fantasy football.
Well,
but I really enjoyed it. It was fun. I mean, I don't know, maybe we're time capsules of a different time, but I thought it was fun. And it definitely made me pay attention to players outside of those on my beloved Packers.
yeah, well, we owe credit to Devish. He's the one that got us into this endeavor.
Yeah, wherever you are, Devish, thank you.
Well, I agree. It was fun. But that being said, Brad, we did come in last place.
Well, wait. I see a challenge flag on the field, Greg.
Yes.
Actually, you came in last place.
Remember,
well, you and I were next to each other in seventh and eighth, and we had the toilet bowl. And lo and behold, I won the toilet bowl. So actually, you are in last place. I'm just outside of last place.
I don't think the loser's bowl is really anything for great bragging rights.
Well, what do they say? To be better than the worst still isn't necessarily good, but that being said, it's still better than being worst.
I still don't get it because I ended the season with a better record than you and more points. So I'm still not sure how I ended up coming in last place.
Yeah. So the playoffs are a whole new season, my friend. And regardless, I think I have something here new that's going to blow your mind.
Oh, blow my mind. Well, okay. What's that?
Get ready. This is going to be huge. It's going to sweep the nation. Fantasy forestry.
Okay. Fantasy forestry league.
Yep. It's going to be big.
Exactly how does that work, Brad?
All right. Now, picture this. You're in a draft.
Yeah.
You draft a star forester. You draft a cover type. You draft silvicultural treatments. And it's going to be big, Greg. It's going to be huge. Yahoo and everyone's going to pick this up. We're going to be betting on this before long.
I didn't know you could draft a silvicultural treatment, but okay. How is something like this scored?
Well, you earn points along the way. Points for economic, ecological, social, cultural benefits. And, of course, this is no fall football season, mind you. This is forestry. So it's going to take a little longer to actually see what the score is.
A little longer? Like an entire rotation? I'll be dead before we make it to the playoffs.
Well, we can speed it along a little bit.
Okay, well, let me think about this. Okay, I got to draft a forester. Silvicultural treatments. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'll take my friend Tim Friedrich as my star forester.
Ooh,
I'm gonna
good choice.
I'm gonna pick a cover type of oak.
Yep.
I'm gonna draft irregular shelter wood and, of course, prescribed fire.
And I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think we're going to have to organize this a little bit. So we're going to need a commissioner, and our draft is not going to be just what you want, right? So it's going to be everyone gets a chance at this. So I think our colleague Devish would be a good commissioner for this. And I don't know, you really want Friedrich? He's got bad knees. He's on injured reserve already.
I think I'll still take him. I think he'll be ready to go by Sunday.
Yeah, and just so you know, there's no way I'm going to let you have prescribed fire in this whole thing.
Oh, well, no, I'm going to draft that, but you could always trade with me. It depends on what you got.
All right, well, okay, slow down. We haven't even held the draft. But first, you may want to listen to today's episode of Silvicast. Joining us today is Mike Saunders, professor of silviculture in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University. We're going to speak with Mike about his research into the effects of prescribed fire on oak forests and timber values. Prescribed fire has both cost and benefits, which we'll discuss. Now, are you sure you want to draft it? I'll trade you deer protection.
No, I'll take my chances on fire.
This season of Silvicast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the Silvicast world go round, so thank you. Mike Saunders. Welcome to Silvicast. Before we get started, why don't you tell our audience about who you are, where you work, and what you do?
I'm a professor of silviculture at Purdue University down in Indiana. My interest has been, I've kind of been raised in ideas of silviculture and recently, in the last 10 years or so, really taken up the mantle of fire ecology in this area. So my research, I look at the effects of fire on oak ecosystems. I look at invasive species research. I'm also affiliated with the Hardwood Tree Improvement Regeneration Center we have here at Purdue. Just recently been very involved in the Institute for Digital Forestry that we've started here at Purdue University.
Oh, cool.
The last hat I hold is I'm the editor-in-chief for Forest Science.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. One of the things we were digging, we always have to dig around, and look at what everybody does before we get them on the episode. And
Brad does that.
yeah, it's whatever. So just for our listeners, you went to Iowa State, so a proud Iowa State grad. And I think about, Greg, our time at Stevens Point when, everyone was trying to decide, what do you want to do? We were all like, should I do wildlife? Should I do forestry? And if I read your stuff right, Mike, you said, well, I can just do both of them. So you had undergrads in both wildlife and forestry.
Yeah, I actually got 2 bachelors.
Yeah.
And you can blame at the time, my girlfriend, but now my wife for that. She transferred from a small liberal arts college there and was going to be there a total of 5 years. So I was like, well, I'll have an extra year here before she's done. So why don't I get another degree?
Wow. Oh, that's fantastic.
I just thought you couldn't make up your mind because I got in and we had to take all those intro classes, right, to all of them.
Yeah.
And I started out in wildlife management. And then I think I decided, well, there was more jobs in forestry. So I switched.
Yeah. It's kind of funny how you hear about places, but more and more I'm impressed with Iowa State and because you guys have had a really strong forestry program for a really long time.
Yeah, it's been I haven't been in close contact with some of the professors there. Yeah, they've done well. There always was a lot of Iowa State grads pretty high up in the Forest Service. Yeah. I was always quite impressed with that. You always get these looks because, well, don't they only have corn in Iowa?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Our colleague Kirsten Held went there, and so she gives us the lowdown on no, we don't just look at corn in Iowa.
Yeah.
And Brad and I had to crash the Iowa alumni party at the SAF convention.
Yeah.
That last year.
We were doing pretty good until we said something about couldn't remember cyclones, so it was like, hey, tornadoes. And it's like, Everyone looks at you like, what? So maybe we'll change that to ratios now or something. So
Mike, did you also work out in the Northeast?
Yeah, I got my PhD at the University of Maine. So I worked on some long-term experiments, silvicultural experiments on the Penobscot experimental forest, and then did some biometrics work out there after I got my PhD. So I had a short postdoc there.
Okay. Yeah, your name came up because we were talking to Bob Seymour last month.
Yep.
And so your name came up.
Yeah, I know Bob quite well. Probably have some good stories about Bob too.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Yep. We had the pleasure of meeting you, Mike, in 2023 because you were here in Wisconsin at our Wisconsin SAF state meeting. And that was in the Wisconsin Dells, and you talked about prescribed fire wounding and minor tree degradation in oak forests, which was based on your research that you and your colleagues did describing timber damage and regeneration response to multiple applications of prescribed fire. And I know I really got a lot out of that discussion. In fact, a lot of people afterwards, I've heard that conversation come up a number of times, kind of referencing what you talked about there. Mm-hmm. Could you give us a really broad or like a 30,000-foot view of what that research been behind some of this?
It was pretty interesting how that got started. I had a graduate student who went over and worked for the Wayne National Forest. They had come back to campus and was visiting with. I asked them, well, what are you guys doing for burning over there in the Wayne National Forest? And he said, we don't burn over there because we're too afraid we're going to damage all our timber. And that was something I had heard echoed from some of the highest levels in the Division of Forestry here in Indiana. They didn't want to burn because they were too afraid they were going to damage all their timber. And I knew enough about fire to say, and how you use prescribed fire to say that doesn't make sense. So I came at it from the perspective of, well, we need to document what I feel like I already knew in terms of the effects of prescribed fire on oak forest. And in the process of that, we've learned quite a few nuances about the use of fire in these stands. All this research is based on a survey of over 200 sites across the Wayne, Hoosier, Mark Twain, and Daniel Boone National Forests, where we retrospectively went back to these stands that had all been burned at various times over the last 25 years, had multiple applications of fire over this time, and tried to see what kind of damage that we found in the overstory timber on these sites. We revisited a subset of those sites on the Hoosier and the Wayne, largely due to COVID. We couldn't go to all the sites, and looked at regeneration responses and effects on mid-story. So that's kind of where all of this research kind of developed from.
Yeah, I didn't realize there was a regeneration component to that. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
Yeah. Brad and I were thinking about like where to start because there's a lot of different tentacles to this
There is.
research, like different effects. And so maybe one place to start is just species effects, because I know that you examine like the differences in those prescribed fire impacts on species. So can we talk a little bit what those differences were? Were there species that were more resistant to fire-related wounding, that sort of thing?
When I start talking about species, effects, you can think of it in a couple ways. One, you can think of tree species being resistant to being wounded in the first place. And then the second aspect of that is, well, if a species is wounded, how well can it compartmentalize that wound? Or how much damage does that wounding cost in the long term? A lot of my species effects is kind of separated into these components of what's the probability of being wounded, as well as what is the probability you are wounded, to see actually some type of grade reduction or some type of economic damage. In that respect, I mean, it gets a little convoluted. You can see some species get wounded quite easily. Red maple was one of those that got wounded quite easy. Even northern red oak got wounded pretty easily. We saw, across all the sites we looked at, these would be sites that included 1 burn up to 5 or 6 burn.
Mm-hmm.
We had better than 30% of northern red oak seeing some wounded. White oak was kind of in the middle. About a quarter of the white oak would get wounded on these sites. But surprisingly, we saw, looking at the data right now, like shortleaf pine was really low, proportion of wounding. Tulip poplar, chestnut oak, those were all species that had less than 20% wound.
I believe the red oak would have more, but I was surprised to see that on the tulip poplar. I would think that would have been higher.
So in a retrospective study, a lot of things get confounded in terms of you can't separate out factors. And tulip poplar is a good example of that. What I'm hypothesized is that when we have multiple fires, the fires basically kill off the tulip poplar. It takes it out, the smaller diameter tulip poplar, because it has thinner bark. But when you look at tulip poplar that are saw log sized and larger, by that time, the tulip poplar has relatively thick bark and can resist fire. So those large, 15, 20-inch size tulip poplar can be pretty resistant to fire. At least a prescribed fire.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And like you said, that retrospective study, you don't know the stuff you can't see, right?
Right, exactly. And I think some of our patterns we see in here in this research are definitely because of that. You can't measure stuff that's already gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. So species made a difference, and that species kind of like, if I'm hearing this right, that kind of depending upon the thickness of that bark could play a role in some of that as well. Then.
Absolutely. And, just some species are fire adapted. I mean, when you think of shortleaf pine,
Hmm.
shortleaf pine has relatively thick bark. The bark is it kind of is fluffy in that some of the outer layers of the bark can peel off if it catches on fire. So you don't see as much of the damage in those shortleaf pine, even though the shortleaf pine that we measured was almost exclusively in the Mark Twain National Forest. That's where we saw some of the highest overall fire damage. But it's because the goal of the managers in the Mark Twain National Forest was to regenerate shortleaf pine. It's not to regenerate oak. They have all the oak they want in the world. It's
Hmm.
like they're trying to burn it hot enough to kill the oak and get the shortleaf pine.
Mm. I think that the distinction you made, Mike, in the beginning is really important, is that difference between whether it gets wounded, but whether or not it can deal with that wound in terms of losses. So what were those differences like when you start looking at that aspect of it, the compartmentalization and the actual damage?
So in general, in that situation, in general, white oaks are going to do much better than red oak. White oaks compartmentalize the wounds much better, and that's been established with multiple studies over several years. It's the tyloses, it's the wounding response, the wounding ribs that form. Those all seal off that wound from degradation and decay a lot better than in red oak. In red oak, because they don't have the tyloses, it stays much more exposed. They don't heal as well. I mean, the kind of a contrast of what a red oak is just trying to heal over it as fast as it can. It grows faster, tries to heal over it, but that doesn't prevent the damage, the decay fungus from spreading throughout the base of the tree. Where with the white oak, they might grow slower, but they have that kind of compartmentalized off. So the decay, the stain, fungus, whatever gets in there to degrade wood quality can keep it pretty much isolated to that surface near that wound.
So it kind of contains it,
Right.
even though that bark cavity hasn't like grown over yet.
Yeah. That's what we have found there, and we can talk about this later. A little bit of the lumber recovery work that we've done, looking at actually sawing some of these damaged trees out.
Mm-hmm.
I think you mentioned it earlier, and this could be something that managers might be interested in, but it's kind of one of those things that, like you mentioned before, we probably know, but we still need to document. But larger trees essentially had easier times with the fire as opposed to the smaller trees, and what you found too.
A little bit. It was really messy though, because we couldn't really document a statistical effect of tree diameter on percent wounding or grade reduction. It was much more convoluted than that. I think part of it is that we're looking at trees that are, you know, saw log size. So
Mm-hmm.
they've already built up some resistance to fire already. They already have that thicker bark. So they're less susceptible. I think had we been able to track this information or track these stands over time, which I do have a couple studies we're looking at that, I think we would obviously see a diameter effect that would just be more pronounced in smaller diameter trees,
Mm-hmm.
like less than 10 inches.
Yeah.
And like you said, those smaller ones, if you would have lost them out of those sites earlier, you wouldn't know at this point.
I can't know anything because it's not there. And that's the weakness of a retrospective study when you can't track it over time.
Yeah. I was really interested, Mike, in looking at the different kinds of wounds that you tracked within that. So were there certain wound types that were more common? Were they different for different species? What was that like?
It was actually surprising that most of our wounds, we had three wound types that really kind of showed up and across, we surveyed over 8,000 trees, and these wound types showed up almost identically. Like it was like 1,100 to 1,150 And it was calf faces, bark slough, and fire-caused seams. Almost equal representation across all the species and all the sites in total. I mean, I'm sure that there was there was a lot of factors here. There probably was some nuances. There's a little bit of nuances in terms of species and what was more common and on what site types, but it was really hard to pick those differences apart.
So my ignorance of fire, Jed Mounier, our colleague's going to get me for this. So cat faces would be just sort of those where the fire wraps around and it causes sort of a circular type of wound.
Right. So calf face is basically a open wound. So you'll see the underlying wood structure, and that is generally at the bottom of the tree. It usually forms a triangle at the bottom of the tree.
Right.
Usually formed when there's a buildup of, you get a large, that's where we have the thickest duff in a stand, is right near the base of a tree.
Sure.
Or litter, or you get branches that are leaning against a tree down there along the base. You get really hot spot on the uphill side of the tree. You get a really hot spot, and that's where we'll see cat faces a lot of times form. If it's up a little higher and it's not kind of down at the surface, and it's like maybe a suspended piece of deadwood that catches fire and it burns right against the tree, we'll get what are open wounds, but we call those ovals. So the only difference between a cat face and an oval is the oval's up high and it doesn't connect to the ground, where a cat face is more triangular.
Right.
A lot of the dendrochronology work they do out west with ponderosa pine and other species, they're always taking slices off of cat faces to age the stand. Seams, they can actually just be a physical crack in the bark. It can extend into the wood, caused by temperature differential during the fire. Those are more closed, although they can open slightly over time with freeze thaw cycles or multiple burns. It can kind of burn away at the edges of those into the wound tissue. Bark slough is basically, in a sense, a cat face that hasn't opened up yet. It's where the bark has been killed and the bark is just kind of loose. It hasn't fallen off or been burned off yet. So bark slough can turn into that. I think I've covered all of the major wound types that we kind of characterized.
Is there an intensity difference between those? So like with that, the bark slough, would that be, say, less intense than maybe like a cat face? Or is it just a difference in age between the two? Like one's an early stage, one's a later stage?
It's both.
Both.
Yeah, because I mean, you can get a cat face form in one fire, and that's usually because there's been intense, there was prolonged intense fire on that stem that caused that allowed it to burn through the bark. It could also form that it just killed the cambium, and it takes a few years for that bark slough to come off, and then a successive fire comes along and burns that dead bark off. So, yeah, it's difficult. There's multiple pathways.
Yeah. Yep.
Was there differences between the species in terms of the wounds? Like, did some species have a certain kind of wound more often?
Yeah, there was only a few that really kind of stood out. We saw that red oaks in general had more cat faces than other species, particularly more than white oaks. And I'm using red oaks as the group.
Mm-hmm.
And then white oaks as the group had more seam, so significantly more seams than the other wood types.
Well, that's interesting.
We discussed compartmentalization of the two, and that could be somewhat related. At least the idea that calf faces were more common in red oaks. You can't compartmentalize; it'd be more likely for them to open up and get larger wounds.
Yeah, so they just keep that thing growing, especially with repeated fires.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting in that paper that you found this background of, that must have been on your control, this background of wounds on unburned sites of about 10%. Just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I knew that, one, we're not perfect at detecting if that wound is fire caused or not. So by going to control sites that had not had fire in 10 years, or in 20 plus years, at least recorded fire, we kind of could get that background rate of just general wounding that happens with any stand that, some of these stands were managed. They probably had some timber harvest. Some of them had timber harvest during this time. Some of them did not. So it's like, what is kind of this background wounding rate with just general management? And then a check against our methodology.
Yeah. That is useful for the conversations because I know, like you mentioned previously, everyone's afraid of introducing more wounding, but you've already got a lot of wounding. So
Yes.
it's not like it's maybe like facing up to that fact, which is kind of refreshing.
Did you say, Mike, what percentage of those 8,000 trees had wounds?
Overall,
Yeah.
I don't have that number right on the top of my head. Depending on species, it ranged from 10 to almost 40%. It was not a ton though.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning earlier when we were talking about that 20% level or so for some of those species.
Yeah, like if I look at my whole sample, I got this slide up that I'm trying to recall here, and when we had fire, like for white oak, we had about 32% of the white oak that showed some type of wound. When there was no fire, it was about 8%.
Hmm.
And I have similar comparisons, like red oak was 40% wounded with fire, 14% without. So red oak even had higher wounding rates without fire. And those type of differences, doubling to threefold increase in wounding from a control and unburned control to a burn site, to a burned area, depending on species.
Yeah. So a lot of us in the field, we're talking to managers, we're talking with foresters. And so I think sometimes foresters are like, okay, maybe we can do this. But then there's that realization, wait, we're going to be doing repeated burns in these areas. And so I thought it was really interesting that you guys looked at what was that impact of not just one fire, but like the number of fires on what was happening in the stand. And so you guys actually took a look at it and looked at what that likelihood of tree grade reduction as a result of that. How did that turn out?
Yeah. So what we generally found was, although wounding would just kind of step up with every application of fire, we get more and more trees wounded. Grade reduction within those wounded trees would stay relatively constant. So it just meant more and more trees were getting wounded, but there wasn't a ton of additional economic loss per se. So it stayed relatively constant around 20% grade reduction up till about 4 fires. And then after you got beyond 4 fires, we started to see increases. So you'd start to see more and more trees getting more severe, probably more severe wounds, reburns of existing wounds, perhaps breaking down of compartmentalization, because obviously it takes a lot longer time period to do 5 burns as opposed to 2 burns. So
Yeah.
by the time you've gotten 5 burns done, you might be 15, 20 years out. By that time, those decay fungi and these other damage vectors, they're going to probably even breach the compartmentalization that, like, say, a white oak would put up. So you have this number of fires and time that's confounded. And there's been a lot of research done down in the Ozarks that said that, like 15 years out, that's when we start to see a lot more damage in sawn timber coming from burn stands. Joe Marshall and his colleagues down there did some work on that. That I'm pretty much seeing the same pattern.
So it's both that number of burns, but it's also that time factor.
Absolutely.
Of allowing any initial wound of aging and, becoming worse over time.
I always wonder about that, Greg, with, being in the field here in Wisconsin. We might be walking a ridge or walking through a woods, and we'll see these huge cat faces and all sorts of problems with it. And as foresters, we're like, oh, fire, it's a huge problem. But then we don't step back to realize that fire might have occurred back in the 60s or the 50s. And we're looking at it today. So it was like not a recent fire, but a long time. And so, yeah, you wound something, it's going to be a long time yeah, you're naturally going to have a problem with it.
Does it make a difference how close together those burns are?
I don't think I can detect that in my study. That's a question I really didn't address. My gut feeling, though, is that it's more a question of the entire length of not how close they are together. Obviously, the shorter the period since the initial wounding response, the less likely you're going to see economic damage in the longer term. There could be a potential, obviously, the trees would not be able to heal over a wound. It's a very short period. And I guess that could come into play on some situations, but that'd probably be on have to be on pretty rich sites that are already being able to have the growth capacity to heal over the wound quickly. We're trying a lot of times when we're trying to apply fire on the landscape, we're looking at more xeric sites that are probably going to be lower quality, lower productivity, and not be able to. The trees are not growing as fast.
Right.
So with those multiple burns, you mentioned those 3 types of wounds. Did you see changes in the numbers of those kind of appearing, like maybe some becoming more common with multiple burns versus other things like that?
We saw an increase definitely in cat faces, more and more open wounds as we get more burns. That probably, seems stayed pretty consistent. So just for example, like cat faces increased from about 7-8% after one burn, and then the kind of leveled off right around 20% after 3 or more burns, where seams kind of jumped around up and down from 5 to 11. I got 14% almost, depending on burn class, number of burns, and if you look at the errors associated with those estimates, they all overlap. So that was just a sample artifact. Bark slough increased slightly, increased like twofold from about 7 or 8% up to 25% on some of the 4 and 6 burn classes. We had a few sites that were burned 6 times. You start seeing a lot of damage in those.
Yeah.
Barring those ones that have been burned tons of times, but that 4 or less category, and kind of getting to your initial statement about what that impact was on the grade reduction and the economic loss, were there differences between species or species groups in terms of that grade reduction? Did some have more, others had less, or were they consistent?
No, we looked at grade reduction. It was conditional on the tree having to be wounded in the first place.
Yeah.
So we did this whole analysis. But if you start to really want to think about it in terms of, okay, if I put a fire on the ground, what proportion of my trees, what proportion of my white oak are going to be economically damaged? And be economically damaged largely means it's going to have a large enough wound that it sees grade reduction. That's only 3%, 3.5%. 3.5% of the sawlog sized trees will see that impact with having a fire put on it. And I can't separate it and say it's a single fire. I just fire as a whole, whether it's 1 to about 4 applications, just you put fire in the ground, you expect to see about 3.5% of your white oaks seeing damage. Chestnut oaks, only 2.5%. Shortleaf pine, 2.5%. So they tend to be very resistant to receiving enough damage to cause economic harm. But if you start looking at the red oak group, the northern reds, the black oaks, you're up to 5 to 6 to 7%. Hickory, sugar maple, beech, they're all in that 5 to 10% range. So 5 to 10% of those trees will receive some economic damage. And then you get the really xeric post oaks and scarlet oaks that probably we've measured mostly in Missouri on the pine sites. They were over 10%. And then red maple was surprisingly across our whole study that, over 10% of the red maple received some type of grade reduction.
And the foresters out there are going, is that all?
Yeah.
I was trying to kill that stuff.
Well, there's a lot of people that use a lot of applications of fire to try to kill red maple, and it still comes back. The red maple uglier and uglier every
Yeah.
time.
It's still tough.
Yeah.
Well, I think this kind of gets to the crux of that question that we talked about right in the beginning of foresters being concerned. What is going to be the economic loss of using fire as a management tool on this? So I don't know. To me, that seems like pretty modest levels of grade reduction.
It is. I think the danger here, and we have to realize, is that I went out and I was basically just kind of looking at typical U.S. Forest Service grades. But when you look at the value in a stand, you know, I was once told that 5% of the trees in the stand make up 75% of the stand's value.
Mm-hmm.
If you damage those 5% and you damage them really badly, you have a huge loss.
Yeah.
Hmm.
This doesn't give us free will to use fire in the stand. It just means we need to be careful about our use of fire. In my stands, we have some black walnut or some veneer quality white oak in a stand. I should be going out with a leaf blower and blowing around those trees and trying to get the litter out, and definitely making sure I don't have big pieces of coarse woody debris leaning up against that tree.
Mm-hmm.
So you still need to be careful.
Yeah. Greg, do you remember we had Joe Marshall up in, I think it was 2018, and he spoke in Dodgeville about some of these things that he'd been looking at, but he had the analogy of swinging a hammer at his truck versus his boss's truck.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So he said, basically, you were saying, if you're using it, knowing that context of where you're using the fire, if you swing the hammer and it hits his boss's truck, well, that's a really valuable truck, and that's going to be all sorts of problems. But if he swings a hammer at his truck, it's like you can't even tell because it's got all sorts of other problems or, things like that. So it's really just knowing where you are and what the consequences could be. Like you were saying, know where the valuable trees are, and if you have a stand that's full of those, maybe just change the context for your fire in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. Use that knowledge within the context of the site you're working with. Minimize those economic losses, as you said. And we have done that. I've seen that done in stands where we've leaf blowed around the nicest quality walnut trees before putting fire through.
Yeah. Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the Silvicast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show. I would imagine there must be something you can't really incorporate here, too, because so you use the fire, and I think you guys looked at, and you're starting to look at regen. And so if that fire causes some degradation in quality or loss of value in one place, you might be getting an increase in value because now you have maybe oak regeneration that you don't have to pay for, other things to put into that situation. So it's maybe like if you took a really long-term approach, maybe it levels out a little, or maybe it even goes the other way.
Exactly. And I think that's what I'm working on most recently. I just started a graduate student to kind of try to do this economic analysis where we try to capture the cost to the previous stand, the cost of value of the previous stand, as well as the benefit for creating the next stand.
Yeah.
It's like when we do economic analysis, and I'll probably get some feedback on this, but as a silviculturalist, the reason I harvest a stand is to create a new one. I've always resisted this idea that of having a 0 year as the start of the new stand, because I should be taking my cost associated with getting my new stand and using the proceeds from the harvest to pay for that. When you do economic analysis, everybody wants to say, okay, we're just going to start it when we plant the new stand. But I don't think that's fair.
Yeah. Right.
And that's why it makes forestry look like it's a bad investment in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
We need to start accommodating the idea of overlapping rotations, and maybe our 0 point should be stem exclusion. I don't know. Our 0 year.
And especially with oak or species like oak, that there's a long time period in there. It's not I planted last year and that's the start of my stand.
Right.
So we are looking at that to follow up on this work. We've actually harvested over, I think, almost 200 of the trees from these different sites. We did this partially over COVID, and I have a student analyzing that where we sawed up all those trees at a couple mills, one in southern Indiana and then one over in Ohio, and trying to validate what we've been measuring in terms of stumpage rates, in terms of value losses, and then trying to rectify that against the costs of regeneration.
Oh, that'll be really interesting.
Yeah.
Then we'll have to have you back on to talk about that. So that'll be good.
Sure, happy to do that.
One thing, Mike, that I didn't realize until a little later on was that there was a regeneration part of this. So,
Correct.
So were there some things that you learned about the regeneration by looking at this retrospective study?
Yeah, so this came from a subset of those. Again, the Hoosier National Forest and the Wayne National Forest, which are some of our more mesic forest. I mean, and we saw quite a bit less fire damage across these stands. But basically, we saw that, increasing burning increased the proportion of larger competitive seedlings. So it took, 3 or 4 burns before we really had large enough oak that could probably be competitive if you took the overstory off in some type of shelter wood, in an overstory removal harvest of a shelter sequence. And then we also saw that, granted, most of these stands we started with were very oak heavy because that was kind of the goal. But we did see the increase in proportion of those large seedlings were increasingly oak with more and more applications of fire. So it took like 3 or 4 applications to really to really push down the maple and the beech.
And you think that was kind of the factor there? It was getting rid of the maple beech component, or maybe that mid-story component that allowed that?
Absolutely. When we looked at mid-story, the effects on the mid-story, we really didn't see much of a reduction in the mid-story until we got more than like 3 or more burns. It took that many applications of fire to really drive down the number of mid-story stems. We dropped the mid-story by almost 2/3 after 4 burns.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me, and that's what we've seen in just our ordinary day-to-day management is just a one fire or two. You can't take care of that mid-story, and you got to go either in there mechanically or with herbicides or repeated burns in order to knock that back. They're just too big.
I would think, Greg, what I've seen in that is that oftentimes with 1 or 2, you'll see a reduction in the really small stems.
Yeah.
But then you still have that lingering kind of probably where a lot of that shade in the mid-story still is.
Right.
It probably takes a while to get at that. But that's really interesting.
Right. You get into those 3 and 4 inchers and
right.
That first fire or two hardly touches them.
I think that's probably the lingering, when we think about fire suppression, that period that we've had in the eastern U.S., I think that's that buildup of large mid-story stems. That's just been it isn't the regeneration, it's those large mid-story stems. And fire, there's a lot of research showing that, it takes a lot of fire to get them out.
Yeah. So this kind of, I think, brings us to, we're kind of getting now into the management implications of this. And when you spoke with us at the SAF meeting, you kind of had some takeaway points. And I think, Brad, we were going to sort of go through those takeaway points, and maybe they kind of retouch on stuff we've just talked about, but it's kind of nice to bring it all together. Sure. And maybe that would be a good way for us to talk about it.
Yeah, I know I always appreciate someone putting takeaway points at the end of a presentation or something like that, because then you're like, wait, I got to pay attention here, so then off you go. So I thought it was really good. So yeah, I think we should kind of review those. So you had 8 of them, and we can maybe just list them, and you can, and again, these are going to repeat some of this stuff, but I think it's worth talking about. So 1, tree species differ in susceptibility to wounding and subsequent damage.
Yeah, we definitely saw that. If I had to summarize that point, the white oaks were generally more resistant to damage than the red oaks. And the red oaks were generally equivalent to some of the, like sugar maple and beech, which was actually a little bit surprising.
And that does tell us just a little bit about the fire ecology of those species too, because you do see those red oak on those more mesic sites, at least here in Wisconsin in the upper Midwest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is great, Brad, because this is like the cheat sheet version of this talk. So I really like this. Go on.
That's right. Yeah, well, so number 2, absolute volume and value losses were quite low after repeated prescribed burns.
Yeah, our mean value loss was about $50 of stumpage, $50 of stumpage. It ranged from anywhere from 0 to $273. That's an absolute value, and that's a little biased because, if you have a high quality stand, you're going to have more value. So if you start looking at it in a relative context, it was generally less than 10% of stumpage, most of the time down in the 1 to 2% range. We got 10% on some of the, when you burned it like 7 or like 4 or 5 times. And in the Ozarks, we got quite a bit more relative value loss. But generally, it was anywhere from, like on the Hoosier and the Wayne, it was anywhere from 0 to 4%.
Well, that's heartening. Yeah, that's good stuff.
With the caveat, don't burn up your $10,000 walnut tree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's add that caveat in.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that'll be like the after hours version of Silvicast where we talk about fire and walnut. That's got to have a couple drinks to go with that.
Yeah.
Especially if we're talking to somebody from Indiana. So
yeah.
We're on to number 3. Yeah. So if you increase the number of prescribed fires in a stand, you are likely to increase the relative volume lost regardless of site.
Yeah, that's correct. We did not see any effect of aspects, surprisingly, versus like mesic slopes versus xeric slopes, but we did see that relative volume loss and value loss would increase with the number of applications of fire.
And was that, we also talked about once you got beyond those 4 fires, it increased
considerably
more.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Considerably more.
Yeah. Okay. Number 4, wounding increases with more fire, but tree grade is relatively resistant to that.
Yeah, we saw again that every application of fire kind of increased wounding up to, again, till we got 4 or 5 fires and it stayed relatively constant. But, you would see this increase to about 20% of the trees would show some type of grade reduction even after 1 fire. And that stayed pretty constant until we got, again, up to 5 or 6 fires.
Yeah. So don't be afraid of more than 1 fire.
Don't be afraid of using more than 1 fire in that regard. You could probably go up to 3 or 4 pretty easily.
Yeah. Okay. Number 5, if you increase the number of prescribed burns, you increase the number of large seedlings and the proportion of oak in the regeneration pool.
Yeah, we saw that in our regeneration study, that when you had fire and you used it repeatedly, you would basically kill off those smaller sugar maple, beech, and really shift the pool more towards oak.
Yeah.
And ultimately, our goal is to build large competitive oak.
Yeah. And I think for foresters, it means we kind of have to have some patience too, right? Like we go out there after the first burn and go, where's the oak? And it's like, all right, this might be a longer term process.
Patience and persistence.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Patience and persistence. All right. Number 6, waiting more, and maybe there's a caveat, waiting more than 4 years after a prescribed burn to burn again results in fewer seedlings and an increase in the proportion of maple and beech in the regeneration pool.
Yeah, we were able to tease apart that trend in our data that we saw that fire where they hadn't been persistent and they just kind of let the interval lapse or skip the burn. And we saw that the maple and the beech came back. Obviously, they're seeding in there every year. And they had gotten large enough now that they were being competitive with the oaks that were there and started to get a little bit more resistant to fire because they were large enough. So when you let fire lapse, when you let your burn interval lapse, you can run into that danger of actually having the maple and beech make a comeback.
Do you think that would be impacted by maybe how mesic that site is? So if it's a drier
absolutely.
site, yeah.
We couldn't detect that in our data. We didn't have a large enough sample in that regards, but I think the more mesic of a site, I think the more problem you're going to have.
Yeah. Okay, number 7, Many of the regeneration patterns are being driven by the impacts of prescribed fire in the midstory.
Yeah, these regeneration, we didn't see strong regeneration responses in some respects, but particularly the mesocites had relatively thick mid stories, and it took 3 or 4 times before we would really drive down the number of stems in the mid story and see any kind of strong regeneration response. And that's been my experience in applying fire. It takes at least 2 to 3 times to even start to see impact on a mid story, unless I've seen it happen a couple times faster than that, but then we had a lot of overstory tree damage.
Yeah. You don't want to go too fast because then you all the other. It's hard to do that.
And what you said too, just overall about that importance of controlling mid-story, and that's really consistent with others we've spoken to, like Patrick Brose and Dan Day, and all those about that mid-story is really hindering that development of competitive oak.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the last point then that you had was preliminary data suggests lumber recovery matches stumpage.
Yeah, we have some of the data back in from from the Indiana sawmill, and basically the patterns that we saw coming out of the Hoosier National Forest, it was that subset of logs that we harvested. The lumber recovery, relative value loss, relative volume loss almost mirrored what we saw in the stump. So that was nice to see it validate our methodology.
Yeah.
We just need to check all the data yet.
Yeah. I guess that'll be nice because it's one thing to convince the foresters, it's another thing to convince the mills.
Or the timber buyers.
Exactly.
Yeah, I remember when we went to that mill and we actually saw the owner actually donated her time and the mill's time to sawing that all up for us.
Nice.
Oh, wow.
But she had huge doubts on the study because she's like, I don't want fire in the landscape. We just got rid of all of it. We've been milling this stuff that had been burned back in the 50s and it was all rotten. And I'm like, but this is different. And it's like, it was a nice conversation to talk to her and tell her about the difference in the fire ecology and how we can use fire.
Yeah, starting to understand some of the nuances of what fire can do and how you can avoid some of those problems they've seen in the past.
Yeah, the idea of prescribed fire versus wildfire. That's been a big hurdle to get over.
One of the things you did at your presentation there too that I liked is kind of bringing this all together in terms of what you've learned from this work and similar research about what would this look like to use prescribed fire in a silvicultural prescription. So our foresters wondering maybe, how do we mitigate some of those damage differences? How do we really get those competitive advanced regeneration? So what do some of these lessons learned look like in a prescription?
One, I think, you need to start early because it's going to take multiple fires to do this. So start your regeneration process early, 10 to 15 years at least before you plan on taking off the overstory. 2, when you're applying fire, try to target kind of a 2 to 3 foot flame length. That seems to be, based on my experience talking with several fire practitioners and foresters, that seems to be a nice sweet spot. You can get some good, definitely smaller mid-story and clearing out beech and maple seedlings pretty easily and slowly killing off maybe some mid-story stems, but you're not getting a lot of overstory damage. You're going to have to use fire at least 3 or 4 times before you're really going to create a condition on stands that have never seen fire before or haven't seen fire in a long time. That first fire might do very, very little. It might be all you might be doing is getting some of the duff and the litter burned off.
Mm-hmm.
You might not do hardly anything to the mid-story. So I always think of that first fire as a conditional fire, conditioning fire. You're trying to condition the stand to have more fire. It might take 1 or 2 burns to do that before you're really starting to see impacts on the regeneration in the mid-story. So oak regeneration is going to need probably 3 or 4 fires to respond to build up enough oak regeneration where you can feel comfortable about taking off the overstory. we're also dealing with stands that haven't seen fire for so long, have mid-story stems that are huge,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
and to think that fire is going to do that is just not.
Not realistic.
Yeah, you're going to probably have to use some type of mid-story removal to get rid of the larger mid-story.
Yeah.
It'd be better to do that earlier because you're conditioning the stand for regeneration. So it'd be better to do that at the start than it would be to wait too long. Just make sure when you do it at the start, you don't be stacking mid-story stems against your veneer trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's that's a lot of handwork, and so that can be avoided, right?
Yeah.
You can keep those jackpots away from your stems.
Exactly.
And I think that's important. Greg, you may recall one of our friends, Scott Lancaster, a ranger here in Wisconsin. I think he's used the term, we can't burn our stands into submission. So we kind of have to use fire in addition to other tools in order to do that. So that kind of reaffirms that. That's good news.
Yeah. I kind of like, too, that analogy that you mentioned of getting a stand ready for fire, just because it hasn't seen it in so long. It has some very different conditions.
Yeah, I think, especially with the mid-story, another thing you could think about instead of cutting down the mid-story is you could chemically treat it. That would probably keep the fuels off the ground and allow you to avoid some of those potentials for timber damage by jackpots.
Yeah, we've definitely done some of that work, basal bark treatments.
Yeah.
And then fire later.
And I suppose you could even apportion it based on size. So if you knew you were using 2 to 3 foot flame lengths, you might anticipate killing up to a certain size. So everything mid-story at the upper end, maybe that's what you treat.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mike, that was really great conversation because it brings together a lot of stuff, Brad, that you and I have talked about with other guests. And then it also adds this economic component to it, which we really haven't addressed before. So it just kind of, I think, is very helpful, or will be very helpful, Mike, to foresters out there who are looking at applying fire, particularly in these oak, hickory type of stands in our neck of the woods here. Mm-hmm.
Good. I was happy to be here. And again, I'm happy to come back and talk about more on the economics of this once I get the research.
Yeah,
in it.
Get the new research. Sounds great.
Yep.
Okay, well, enjoy the snow because we don't have any.
Will do.
Okay. See you, Mike.
Yeah.
Hey, Brad, we got some mail in the Dropbox.
We got mail in the Dropbox.
Yeah.
We did. Wow. Oh, that's impressive.
Yeah. Mail's in.
No, wait. This proves we have a listener. So thank you guys. All right. Woo! There is proof.
One download. Yeah. No, it was Aaron from Ontario. He had a really good kind of idea for a show. And he's been having some, we'll call them silvicultural discussions. You know what they're like in the field about the value of long suppressed sugar maple trees. So we've had this conversation many times.
Multiple times.
Is regeneration in the understory that's been suppressed a long time, and maybe it's lost apical dominance, maybe it has vigor issues. Is it really viable, good regen? So we're not going to go into that right now because that's a long story. It's the story that we like to call the story of the crapling, right?
Yeah, that's right. You could be on both sides of that too. So it's not like there's one way to go. There are multiple paths to take there.
So super interesting conversation and episode ideas. So just a shout out to Aaron. Thank you for that. Keep them coming.
I love the idea. Send us your problems, right? Because that could be something that would be a really good idea for a Silvicast episode.
Well, don't send us all your problems.
Well, no, not all of, you got marital issues. Yeah,
I got enough of my own. I don't need.
Yeah, no, that's all good. But a subset of problems related to forestry and forest management.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that would be good stuff.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that is.
All right. Well, thank you, at least Aaron, and hopefully there are more of you out there, but thank you for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or a comment if you like. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, a big thank you to our team, Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Joe Rogers, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.